The school hall was usually full of sound. Chairs being moved, students talking, teachers calling names, and the soft echo of music from practice rooms in the distance. But for her, the piano was the only sound that truly mattered. It was not just an instrument to her. It was a place where she could breathe, where her thoughts became clear, and where she felt most like herself. She had been playing the piano for years. It started when she was very young, when her hands were too small to reach all the keys properly. Still, she tried every day. She learned slowly, step by step, with patience and emotion. While others saw music as a subject, she saw it as a language that did not need words. There were times when she would sit alone after school hours, placing her fingers gently on the keys and letting the sounds fill the empty room. Those moments made everything else in life feel lighter. Even when she was tired, she would still go back to the piano. Even when she was stressed, she would still find peace in the same familiar notes. But not everyone understood her passion. In the place where she practiced, discipline and rules were always strict. The environment was serious, focused on order and control. Students were expected to follow instructions without question. Creativity was allowed only when it stayed within limits. Anything that seemed different or emotional was often ignored or discouraged. At first, she did not think much about it. She believed that if she kept working hard, people would eventually understand her music. She thought talent would speak for itself. So she continued to practice quietly, never trying to disturb anyone, always careful to respect the rules around her. However, things slowly began to change. There were small comments at first. Some people said she spent too much time at the piano. Others felt she was becoming too focused on music and not enough on other responsibilities. A few believed that music was just a hobby and should not be taken so seriously. She listened to everything, but she did not argue. She simply kept practicing, believing that her effort would prove her dedication. Still, a sense of distance began to grow between her and the place she once felt comfortable in. One afternoon, after a long day of practice, she was called to speak with someone in charge of the music room. The room was quiet, with a serious atmosphere that made her feel slightly uneasy. She stood there, waiting, not knowing what was about to happen. The words that followed were simple but heavy. She was told that she would no longer be allowed to play the piano in that place. At first, she did not fully understand. It felt like something she needed to hear again to believe. Her mind tried to find a reason, a misunderstanding, or maybe even a mistake. But the expression on the other person's face made it clear that the decision was final. No detailed explanation was given. Only that the rules had to be followed and changes had been made. It was said in a calm voice, but it carried a finality that could not be questioned. She stood still for a moment, not speaking. Her hands, the same hands that had spent years learning every key, suddenly felt empty. It was as if something important had been taken away without warning. She nodded slightly, not because she agreed, but because she did not know what else to do. Then she quietly left the room. As she walked away, everything around her felt different. The hallways she had walked through many times before now felt longer. The sounds of other students practicing music echoed in the distance, but they no longer felt comforting. Instead, they reminded her of what she had just lost. That night, she did not go near the piano. She sat in her room quietly, thinking about everything. Her fingers rested on her lap, but they felt restless. It was as if they still remembered the shape of the keys, still wanted to move, still wanted to play. She tried to distract herself with other things. She opened books, looked at notes, even tried to focus on daily tasks. But nothing stayed in her mind for long. Every thought eventually returned to the same place, the piano, and the silence that now surrounded it. For the first time in a long time, she did not hear music in her mind. Instead, there was only silence. The next day was no different. She went through her routine, but something inside her felt disconnected. She watched others continue their practice as usual. Some of them laughed, some focused deeply on their music sheets, and others prepared for performances. Life around her continued as if nothing had changed. But for her, something had changed completely. She stayed quiet, observing from a distance. No one paid much attention to her anymore when it came to music. It was as if her connection to the piano had been erased in an instant. That feeling was harder to accept than the decision itself. Still, she did not show anger. She did not complain. Instead, she held everything inside. At times, she would unconsciously move her fingers slightly, as if playing invisible keys in the air. It was a habit she could not stop. Music was still alive inside her, even if she was no longer allowed to express it. Days passed like this, quiet, slow, and heavy. But something else began to grow inside her during this silence. At first, it was small, almost unnoticeable. It was not sadness anymore. It was something deeper, a quiet determination, a feeling that she had not truly lost her connection to music, even if she had lost access to the piano. She began to listen more carefully to sounds around her. The rhythm of footsteps, the tapping of pencils, the distant hum of voices. Everything started to feel like part of a larger melody that only she could hear. She did not speak about it to anyone. She simply observed and absorbed. Even though she was away from the piano, music had not left her. It had simply changed its form. And somewhere deep inside, without saying it out loud, she began to believe that silence was not the end of her story. It might only be the beginning of something she had not yet understood. The days after that decision felt different for her in a way she could not explain easily. Everything still looked the same on the outside, but inside her, something had shifted. The piano was no longer part of her daily routine, and that absence created a strange kind of emptiness that followed her everywhere. At first, she tried to act like nothing had changed. She woke up at the same time, followed the same schedule, and walked through the same corridors. But small things kept reminding her of what she had lost. The distant sound of music from practice rooms, the sight of students carrying music sheets, even the faint echo of piano notes in the background. It all felt like pieces of a world she was now standing outside of. She stopped going near the music area completely. It was not because she was told to stay away, but because she felt something inside her pulling her back every time she got close. It was easier to avoid it than to face the feeling of not being allowed to enter that world anymore. Still, music did not leave her mind. Even when she tried to focus on other tasks, her thoughts often drifted. She would find herself imagining piano keys under her fingers, silently replaying melodies in her head. Sometimes she would tap softly on a table or desk without realizing it, following rhythms that only existed in her memory. It was a habit she could not control. The silence around her was not peaceful. It was heavy, carried everything she could not express. At school, she became quieter than before, not because she had nothing to say, but because she felt no one would understand what she was going through. People around her continued with their normal conversations, their practice sessions, and their goals. Life moved forward quickly for everyone else, but for her it felt like something had paused. There were moments when she would sit alone during breaks, watching others pass by. She noticed how easily they talked about music, how freely they practiced, and how naturally they moved around the piano room. It reminded her of how close she once was to that world. She did not feel anger toward them. Instead, she felt something more complicated. A mix of longing, confusion, and quiet sadness that stayed with her for a long time. At night, when everything became silent, her thoughts became louder. She would lie in bed and think about the piano. Not just the sound, but the feeling of it. The way her fingers used to move without hesitation. The way every note felt like a part of her being. She remembered how time used to pass so quickly when she was playing. Hours would feel like minutes. Everything outside the music would disappear. That feeling was now gone, and its absence was difficult to accept. But even in that silence, something was changing inside her. At first, it was very subtle. She began to notice music in places she had ignored before. The rhythm of rain hitting the window, the pattern of footsteps in the hallway, the sound of wind passing through open spaces. It was as if her mind, unable to express music through the piano, was finding it in everything else around her. She did not tell anyone about this. It felt personal, something she needed to understand on her own. One afternoon, while sitting alone, she found herself gently tapping a rhythm on the edge of a table. It was not planned. Her fingers simply followed something she was hearing in her mind. The rhythm grew slightly more complex as she continued, as if she was building a melody without realizing it. For a moment, she stopped and looked at her hands. It felt strange, almost like her body remembered something her situation had tried to take away. She quickly stopped and looked around, making sure no one had noticed. Then she lowered her hands and sat quietly again. But inside, something had been awakened. Later that day, she found a small space where no one usually went. It was quiet, away from most of the busy areas. She stood there for a while, just listening to the silence. Not the empty kind of silence she had felt before, but a different kind. A silence that seemed full of possibilities. Without thinking too much, she closed her eyes. In her mind, she imagined a piano in front of her. She placed her hands on the invisible keys and began to play. There was no sound in the real world, but in her mind the music was clear. Each note felt real. Each movement of her fingers created something that existed only in her imagination, yet felt deeply emotional. As she continued, she realized something important. Even without the physical piano, the music was still alive inside her. It had never truly left. It had only changed its place. When she opened her eyes, the world around her was still quiet, but something inside her had shifted again. This time it was not emptiness. It was awareness. She understood that losing access to the piano did not mean losing music itself. But that understanding did not make everything easier. The desire to play physically was still strong. The connection to real keys, real sound, real performance, it was still something she deeply missed. The next few days continued in a similar way. She stayed in her routine, but now there was something different in how she observed things. She paid more attention to sound, rhythm, and timing in everyday life. Even simple actions began to feel like part of a larger pattern. She noticed how conversations had rhythm, how footsteps had pace, how even silence between moments had structure. These observations slowly started to shape her understanding of music in a new way. Still, she remained distant from the piano room. That boundary had not changed. It was a rule she had to follow, and she did not challenge it. But inside her, the connection was not broken. One day, while passing near a corridor that led toward the music section, she slowed down her steps. For a moment, she stood still. The faint sound of piano notes drifted through the air from inside the room. She did not go in. She simply listened from where she stood. The sound was distant, but it reached her deeply. Her fingers moved slightly again, almost instinctively. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound pass through her. Then she walked away quietly. But this time something was different. She was not walking away from music. She was walking with it still inside her. And even though she did not know it yet, this silent phase was slowly preparing her for something she could not yet see. The silence in her life had started to feel different now. It was no longer just empty or heavy like before. It had slowly turned into something she was beginning to understand. She still missed the piano deeply, but there was a small change inside her that she could not ignore anymore. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, like a small flame refusing to go out. Even though she was not allowed to play, music had not stopped living inside her. Every day, she followed her routine like before. She went to her classes, walked through the same paths, and stayed mostly to herself. But now, her mind was working in a different way. She was listening more, observing more, and feeling everything with more attention than before. It started with small things. The sound of a pen tapping lightly on a desk. The rhythm of footsteps moving through a hallway. The way doors opened and closed at different speeds. Even the sound of wind passing through open spaces began to feel like something meaningful to her. At first, she did not understand why she was noticing these things so clearly. But slowly, she began to realize that her mind was still thinking in music. Even without touching a piano, she was still building rhythm in her thoughts. But the hardest part was still the silence at her fingertips. There were moments when she would unconsciously move her hands as if she was playing. It happened when she was alone, sitting quietly, or even when she was walking without thinking too much. Her fingers would gently press imaginary keys in the air, following patterns that only existed in her memory. She always stopped herself quickly when she noticed. It reminded her of what she was not allowed to do anymore. But at the same time, she could not stop her body from remembering what it had learned for so many years. One afternoon, she found herself sitting alone in a quiet corner of the building. It was a place where people rarely passed. The air was still, and there was no noise except for distant sounds from other rooms. She sat there for a long time without doing anything, just listening. At first, there was only silence. But as she stayed longer, she began to hear things differently. The silence was not empty anymore. It had layers. It had rhythm. It had space between sounds that she had never noticed before. Without thinking, she placed her hands on the surface in front of her. It was not a piano. It was just a simple flat table. But in her mind, she imagined it differently. She closed her eyes, and then she started to play. There was no sound in the real world, but in her mind, everything became alive. She imagined each key under her fingers. She imagined the weight of each note, the rise and fall of melody, and the flow of emotion through every movement. Her fingers moved slowly at first, carefully following the music in her head. Then gradually the pace changed. The imaginary melody became more confident, more expressive. It was as if something inside her had been waiting for this moment for a long time. She did not realize how much time passed. In that silent space, she was not thinking about rules. She was not thinking about restrictions. She was not thinking about what she had lost. For a short moment, she was only thinking about music. When she finally opened her eyes, her hands were still resting on the surface. The room was still empty. Nothing around her had changed, but something inside her felt clearer. She slowly pulled her hands back and looked at them. It felt strange, like her fingers were carrying something invisible but powerful. That day did not change her situation, but it changed something inside her understanding. She began to realize that music was not only something she played on a piano. It was something she carried within her. Even when she was not allowed to express it outwardly, it still existed inside her thoughts, her memory, and her imagination. After that moment, she started to practice in a different way. She did not break any rules. She did not go against what she was told. Instead, she found quiet moments where she could sit alone and imagine music in her mind. Sometimes it was in the early morning before others arrived. Sometimes it was during breaks when she could find a quiet space. And sometimes it was late in the day when everything had settled down. She would close her eyes and let her mind build music from silence. First, it felt simple. Short patterns, small melodies, familiar pieces she already knew. But slowly, her imagination became stronger. She began to create longer sequences, more complex structures, and deeper emotional expressions. It was not the same as playing a real piano. She knew that. The touch of real keys, the sound in the room, the vibration through her hands. None of that could be replaced. But still, something important was growing inside her. Her understanding of music was becoming deeper in a way she had never experienced before. One day, while sitting quietly, she noticed something new. The music she imagined in her mind was becoming clearer than before. She could almost hear it without effort. It felt as if her memory and imagination were working together more naturally. She did not tell anyone about this. It felt too personal, too fragile, like something that could disappear if spoken about too openly. But inside her, confidence was slowly returning. Still, there were difficult moments. There were days when she missed the piano so much that it became hard to focus on anything else. On those days, the silence felt heavier again. The feeling of restriction returned strongly. She would sit quietly, trying to calm her thoughts, but it was not always easy. During those moments, she would remind herself of what she had learned. That music was still inside her, even if it was not visible. She began to notice that even her emotions were changing how she imagined music. When she felt calm, her imagined melodies were soft and flowing. When she felt uncertain, the rhythm became uneven and restless. When she felt hopeful, the music became brighter and more open. Without realizing it, she was learning something deeper than technique. She was learning how emotion shaped sound. One evening, as she was walking back, she passed near the music area again. She slowed down without meaning to. The sound of a piano drifted out from inside the room. It was faint, but it was enough to make her stop. She stood there quietly, listening. Her hands moved slightly again, almost instinctively. But this time she did not stop them immediately. She just stood still, letting the sound reach her. There was no sadness this time, only a quiet understanding. She was still outside that room, still away from the piano, but she was no longer empty. After a few moments, she continued walking. But inside her, something had changed. Not in a sudden way, but in a steady one. Like something slowly becoming stronger without being noticed from the outside. And even though she did not know what would happen next, she was no longer just someone who had lost music. She was someone who had learned to hear it in silence. The days continued to move forward, but something in her life had slowly started to feel different again. It was not a sudden change. It was quiet, like a small shift in the air that only she seemed to notice. She still followed the same routine, still stayed away from the piano room, and still kept most of her thoughts to herself. But now, there was something new growing inside her silence. It was confidence. Not the loud kind that shows itself in words or actions. It was a quiet confidence, built slowly through time spent alone with her thoughts and imagination. She had learned how to carry music inside her even when she was not allowed to express it outside. But life has a way of creating unexpected moments. One ordinary afternoon, the building was more active than usual. There was a sense of preparation in the air. People were moving around more quickly, carrying equipment, arranging chairs, and talking in slightly more urgent tones. Something important was happening, though she did not pay much attention at first. She kept to herself as usual, sitting in a quiet corner, observing from a distance. She was used to staying away from events like this. They were not meant for her anymore. At least that is what she had slowly accepted over time. But that day was different in a way she did not yet understand. There was a scheduled musical gathering in the main hall. It was not unusual for such events to take place, but this one was more organized than usual. The space was being prepared carefully, and people were clearly expecting performances. She heard small pieces of conversation as she walked by. Names of performers, last-minute arrangements, concerns about timing. She did not stop to listen closely. She simply continued walking. But later, something changed the direction of the day. There was a sudden issue. One of the planned performers was unable to continue. The exact reason was not clear to everyone, but it created a problem that needed immediate attention. The program could not proceed as planned, and the room that had been carefully prepared was now filled with uncertainty. People began to talk quietly, trying to find a solution. There was tension but also urgency. Time was passing, and something needed to be done quickly. She was not part of this conversation. She was not involved in the planning. She was not even supposed to be near the event. But she was there in the background watching from a distance. At first, no one noticed her. She was just another quiet presence near the edge of the activity. Someone who had long stepped away from that world. But then, someone suggested something unexpected. There was a brief discussion, a few uncertain looks, and then a glance in her direction. She did not hear the full conversation at first, but slowly, she realized they were talking about her. It was not a decision made easily. There was hesitation, doubt. People remembered the earlier situation, the restriction placed on her, and the rules that had been followed strictly. But now there was a problem that needed a solution, and she was the only one nearby who had the experience. A few moments passed before someone finally approached her. The request was simple but heavy. She was being asked to step in and play. At first, she did not respond. Felt unreal. Her mind tried to process the words slowly, as if they needed time to make sense. She had not touched a real piano in a long time. She had not been allowed to. She had only practiced in silence, in imagination, and in memory. Now, suddenly, she was being asked to return to something she had been separated from. There was a quiet pause between them. She looked toward the hall. The space was already arranged. The piano stood in its place under the lights. It looked familiar but distant, like something from another life. Her first instinct was hesitation. The rules she had followed came back to her mind. The restriction she had accepted. The distance she had been keeping for so long. But something else was also there. A feeling she could not ignore. The memory of music she had carried inside her. The silent practice. The imagination. The moments where she had played in her mind when no one was watching. She slowly took a step forward. Then another. It was not a decision made quickly. It was not a sudden act of bravery. It was something that had been building for a long time inside her silence. As she walked closer to the hall, she could feel the atmosphere change. The noise outside became softer. The attention around her seemed to shift, even though no one was speaking directly. She reached the entrance and stopped for a moment. The room inside was large, quiet in a different way. Not empty, but waiting. People were present, but they were not speaking loudly anymore. There was an expectation in the air. She could feel eyes turning toward her as she stood there. But she did not look at anyone for long. Her focus slowly moved toward the piano. It was still, waiting, just like she had been. She took a slow breath. Her hands felt slightly tense, not from fear alone, but from the weight of everything that had happened before this moment. The silence, the separation, the time she had spent away from it. But she also remembered something else. The music she had built in her mind when no one was listening. The rhythm she had discovered in everyday sounds. The melodies she had created in silence. Step by step, she moved forward. The room remained quiet as she approached the piano. Each step felt heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier because of memory. Lighter because of something new she could not fully explain yet. When she finally reached the piano, she stopped. For a moment, she simply stood there. Her fingers hovered slightly above the keys, not touching yet. The silence in the room was deep now. Even the smallest sound felt meaningful. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. And in that moment, she did not think about rules or restrictions anymore. She did not think about what had been taken away. She thought about everything she had carried inside her. Slowly, she placed her hands on the keys, and everything around her seemed to pause. It was not yet music, but it was the beginning of something that had been waiting for a long time. Her hands rested on the piano keys, but she did not press them immediately. The room was completely silent. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, not empty. Every person inside the hall seemed to be waiting for something, but no one knew exactly what would happen next. Some were curious, some were doubtful, and some were simply watching without any expression. But she was not focused on any of them. Her attention was on the piano. It had been a long time since she had touched real keys like this. The feeling was strange at first. Not unfamiliar, but distant. Like meeting an old part of herself after being away for too long. She took a slow breath. Her fingers moved slightly, adjusting their position. The touch of the keys reminded her of everything she had once known so well. The weight, the texture, the quiet resistance under her fingertips. It was all still there, waiting for her. But something inside her was different now. She was not the same person who had stepped away from this world before. Back then, she had played with freedom but also with expectation. Now she carried something deeper. Silence had changed her. Time alone had changed her. The music she had created in her mind had changed her. She lowered her head slightly and closed her eyes for a moment. And then she played the first note. It was soft, very soft, almost like a question instead of an answer. The sound spread gently through the room. It did not rush. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, slowly filling the silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Even those who had doubts earlier were now completely still. She continued. The second note followed the first, slightly stronger. Then another. A simple pattern began to form, not complex at first, but full of feeling. Her fingers started to remember more quickly now. It was like something inside her had been waiting for this exact moment to wake up. Each movement became smoother, more natural, as if her hands were reconnecting with something they had never truly forgotten. The music was not loud. It did not try to impress, but it carried emotion, deep emotion. It was the kind of sound that did not need explanation. As she played, something changed inside her. The hesitation that had been present at the beginning slowly disappeared. The weight in her chest eased. The tension in her hands faded. She was no longer thinking about rules. She was no longer thinking about being allowed or not allowed. She was only listening. Listening to the sound she was creating. Listening to the way each note connected to the next. The melody slowly grew. It became richer, more expressive. At times, it rose gently like a soft wave. At other moments, it slowed down almost like it was breathing. The room remained completely silent. Even those who had not believed in her before were now unable to look away. There was something about the way she played that held attention without force. It was not just skill. It was feeling. She did not look at the audience. She did not need to. The piano felt like enough. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. The memory of silence had shaped her music in ways she had not expected. Every pause between notes felt meaningful. Every soft transition carried emotion. It was not perfect, but it was real, and that made it powerful. As the melody continued, something unexpected began to happen inside the room. The doubt that had existed before started to fade. People were no longer thinking about why she was not supposed to be there. They were no longer thinking about past decisions or rules. They were only listening. The sound was changing the atmosphere. The hall that had once felt uncertain now felt deeply focused. Every person present was drawn into the same moment, sharing the same silence, the same attention, the same emotion. She felt it, even without looking, and that encouraged her to continue. Her playing became slightly stronger now. Not faster, not louder, but more confident. There was a part of the melody that rose slowly, as if building something important. It carried emotion that was difficult to describe. Not sadness alone, not happiness alone. Something in between. Something that came from everything she had experienced. The restriction, the silence, the time away from the piano, and the quiet practice she had done in her mind when no one was watching. All of it was inside her music now. Her hands moved more freely. The connection between thought and sound felt almost instant. Whatever she imagined became real through the piano. It was as if the instrument was responding to everything she had been holding inside for so long. At one point, she slightly leaned forward without realizing it. Her focus was completely inside the music now. Time felt different. The room, the people, everything around her seemed distant. Only the piano felt real. The melody shifted again. This time it became softer, more delicate, like a quiet conversation. It slowed down, allowing space between each note. The silence between sounds was just as important as the notes themselves. It created a feeling that was both calm and deeply emotional. Some people in the room lowered their heads slightly, as if they did not want to break the moment. Others simply kept watching. Their expressions changed from doubt to quiet attention. She continued playing. Her fingers moved gently, carefully shaping each sound. There was no rush anymore. Only flow, only feeling. And then, something inside the music began to rise again. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a wave building far away before reaching the shore. The melody grew stronger, more expressive, more open. It felt like something breaking free, not in chaos, but in release. Her hands moved with more energy now, but still under control. Every note had purpose. Every movement carried emotion. She was not performing for approval. She was expressing something that had been inside her for a long time. Something that had finally found a way out. The room felt it too. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. Full of attention. Full of emotion. Full of something no one was expecting to feel so strongly. And as she reached the middle of the piece, she did not realize something important had already begun to change in that room. Not just the mood, but the way people were seeing her. She was no longer the person who had been told to stay away. In that moment, she was simply the one who had turned silence into something unforgettable. Her fingers continued to move across the piano keys, but now something in the room had completely changed. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It felt full, almost alive, as if every person inside the hall was holding their breath together. No one spoke. No one shifted in their seat. Even the smallest movement felt impossible, like it might break something delicate that was happening in front of them. She did not notice their reactions at first. Her world had narrowed down to the piano again. The music was flowing through her more deeply now. It was no longer just a sequence of notes. It felt like a story unfolding in real time. Every soft rise and every gentle fall carried something personal inside it. Something that could not be explained in words. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, but not in a rushed way. There was control but also emotion, a balance she had not reached before. It was as if everything she had experienced until this moment had finally found its place inside the music. The years of practice, the silence, the restriction, the imagination, all of it was now part of what she was playing. As she continued, the melody slowly shifted again. It became stronger, more expressive. Not loud in a forceful way, but powerful in feeling. The kind of sound that stays with a person even after it ends. And in that moment, something subtle began to happen in the room. People were no longer just watching. They were feeling. The doubt that had existed earlier was gone now. It had been replaced with quiet attention, and then something deeper. Emotion that no one had expected to feel so suddenly. Some people lowered their gaze slightly, not because they were uninterested, but because the music felt too personal to look at directly. Others remained completely still, their expressions softening as the melody reached different parts of the hall. She still did not look up. Her focus stayed on the piano, but she could sense the change. It was not something spoken. It was something felt. The music had reached them. Her performance continued, moving into a softer section again. The energy did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became more gentle, more thoughtful, like a quiet reflection after strong emotion. Each note now felt carefully placed. There was space between them, and that space carried meaning too. It was not just sound filling silence. It was silence becoming part of sound. Her breathing stayed steady. Her fingers moved lightly, almost like they were telling a story she had carried inside her for a long time. And in that story there was no anger, no resistance, only expression. As she moved into the final part of the piece, something inside her began to rise emotionally. Not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like release. Like something heavy slowly becoming light. The music grew again. Slowly. Naturally. Without force. It was not about showing skill anymore. It was about expressing everything she had not been able to say for so long. The melody filled the room more deeply now. It touched corners of silence that had not been reached before. It made the space feel different, as if the entire atmosphere had shifted into something more meaningful. She felt it too, a sense of connection, not just with the piano, but with everything around her. The room, the silence, the people listening, and even the version of herself who had once been told to stop. Her hands moved through the final transition of the piece. The music began to slow, not suddenly, but gently, like something returning home. Each note now felt softer, more spaced out. The emotion was still there, but it was calming down, settling into something peaceful. The final notes approached. She did not rush them. She allowed them to exist fully, one by one, until the last sound slowly faded into silence. And then it ended. For a moment no one moved. The silence that followed was different from the one before she started playing. It was no longer uncertain. It was full of something unspoken. She kept her hands on the keys for a few seconds after the final note disappeared. Then slowly, she lifted them. Her head tilted slightly downward. She did not know what would happen next. She had not played for approval. She had not played to prove anything. She had only played what she had been carrying inside her for so long. The room remained quiet. A few seconds passed. Then a few more. And then slowly something changed. It started with a single sound. A clap. Then another. And another. It was not loud at first. It began carefully, almost as if people were still trying to understand whether the moment was truly over. But soon more joined in. The applause grew. Not sudden or chaotic, but steady and sincere. She finally looked up, and what she saw made her pause. The expressions in the room had completely changed. There was no doubt anymore. No hesitation. Only appreciation. And something deeper than that, respect. She stood still for a moment, not fully sure how to respond. Her hands were still slightly tense, but her breathing had become calm again. The applause continued, filling the hall, but she did not feel overwhelmed by it. Instead, she felt something quieter, a sense of acceptance, not just from others, but from herself. For a long time, she had believed that being away from the piano meant something had ended, that she had been removed from a world she loved. But now she understood something different. It had not ended. It had only changed form. The music she had created in silence had brought her here. Every moment she had spent imagining, listening, and holding on to rhythm had led to this point. Slowly, the applause began to soften. Not because people stopped appreciating it, but because the moment itself was settling. She took a small step back from the piano. Her fingers rested by her sides now. She did not speak. There was no need to. The music had already spoken for her. As she turned slightly to leave the piano, she noticed something important. The same place that had once told her she could not play was now looking at her differently. Not as someone who had been restricted, but as someone who had created something they would remember. She walked away slowly, not rushed, not uncertain, just steady. And as she left the hall, the sound of the piano still seemed to stay behind in the air, like an echo that would not fade easily. Inside her, there was no longer confusion, only understanding. Music had never left her. It had only been waiting for her to find it again in a new way.